I want to take just a minute to talk to you about a very important topic for this week, and that is families and family partnerships with schools for students with disabilities and IEPs. This is a topic where you're probably thinking, yeah, as general educators, we get the family piece, but there are some additional pieces when we talk about students with IEPs. I'm hoping you took a close look at the two slides right before this one. We're reviewing for the third week in a row those 6 principles of IDEA, which is the federal law for special education. And I highlighted in green on that slide the specific pieces that really connect to families. I think the major one would be number 2, that general educators support the family in participation, comfort, and establishing rights. You're probably one of, if not the closest person to the family of the students. And there are a couple of extra considerations for students with IEPs. When I talk about these things, you don't need to be the expert in these special education pieces. You need to be aware of these special education pieces, parts, and regulations, but that's what your special ed staff there is for, to support you and point you in the right direction, or point parents in the right direction and families, and really help you establish those things that are above and beyond. I also have a slide that outlines, hopefully in layman's terms, in family terms, in general education terms, really the 8 pieces that are the legal rights for families once their student has an IEP. Some of those we've already talked about and are pretty obvious. Some of them are a little bit deeper when we talk about giving or denying consent, or disagreeing with decisions that are made by the school. We're going to get into that down in a few slides, but make sure that you've at least reviewed those and that you're aware of those. I feel like our chapter does a really good job of defining certain things about families of students with IEPs and with disabilities. I encourage you to give this chapter a really good read, because I feel like it does a better job of summarizing those things than I ever would. One of the first things it does is make sure we talk about how we define families. Legally, there is a definition of legal representatives for the student. But more importantly, I think it's important the way we consider them. In the example in the book, they called it the student's entourage. I used to ask my students who their people were, who they lived with, who they would call for a ride, those kinds of things. So make sure you have a wide definition of family and you understand what that means in the legal procedures and processes for students with a disability. It also does a really good job of talking about the 5 domains of quality of life for families. We talk about this a lot in general education, where we've been trained in trauma-based education, trauma-informed education. We talk about the stresses and the anxieties for students and families in our world today. There are extra pieces of that for students, for families of students with disabilities, and our book does a really good job of summarizing that for you. It then extends it into what we're going to talk about this week, is that true family partnership. Our text and the law does a really good job of pointing us towards partnership rather than relationship. And that really connects the pieces with the legal requirements that we just talked about on the last page. If you need more information about that, or you're looking for more resources, our text is a really, really good way, has a really good way and a lot of resources of going about that. It then hones in on the IEP, and specifically the family's rights and responsibilities for meaningful participation in the IEP and their students' education. That looks differently for many families. Some families are communicating with you daily, weekly, they're in school, you've met them. Other families don't have the capacity or the tools to do that right now, and you meet them where they're at also. It's the same that you would offer for the students in your general education class, but there's cause for concern if you have a situation where you're not feeling like you're collaborating with the family if the student has an IEP. The text is a great resource, and then I'm hoping you also have had a chance to dive into that article by Hedin and Cruz. I'm a visual learner, and I really appreciate the way they talk about doing the work upstream in a family partnership that is like a river. Really talking about the trust, the relationship building, and the things that happen upstream, so that as you grow in history and throughout the year with this family, if things happen downstream, if there are issues, if there are problems, things are a lot easier, and they're easier to resolve if there's been work upstream. One of the hardest things I ever had to do was talk to a brand new family that I hadn't had time to establish a relationship with about some pretty disturbing incidents at school. It did not start, that relationship and partnership didn't start out well through no one's fault. They'd also had difficulty upstream with past schools. We managed to repair that situation, but it's not a great place to start. That's just an example. When you talk about things you can do upstream, you communicate, you communicate, you communicate. You make sure those families of students with IEPs are getting the general education and kind of universal school communication, but you're also making a point to reach out to them if they have questions or extra concerns, or there are barriers for them to communicate also. You can help your special education staff document communication with the family or services with the student. But remember that this documentation and this communication is meaningless if the student doesn't, if the family members don't understand. Participation is meaningless unless the families or parents understand. I had an awkward situation with a family. The student and the family were getting all the information from the learning management system, like Infinite Campus or e-learning. And I didn't realize that the family didn't have access or capacity to get those messages through technology like many other families were. And it was causing a real barrier socially, school, all kinds of things for that student. We had to break that down and make sure that the parents understood where the information was coming in from and how to access it so that that student didn't have repercussions for that at school. Remembering also that the IEP is a consensus document between the family and the school and the student. We tend to think extremes, and we think about IEPs where the parent drives everything, or the IEPs where the school makes the decision and they just present it to the family and that's the way it's going to be. The truth lies in the middle. General education teachers, special education teachers, administrators, service providers, family, student, all come together to make that plan and program happen. Sometimes it does look like the school coming in and presenting, but they need to be open and ready to make changes and incorporate everyone's ideas. It's a consensus document, and I think if we remember that more in our family partnerships, there's less trouble. All of this is good faith and good practice that needs to happen upstream. And if you do the work upstream, you don't have the trouble downstream. There's a slide and a couple more down your lecture slides that talks about ensuring parent participation in due process. There is a plan, a legally binding plan for when things fall apart. The first thing everybody on the IEP team should do is turn to mediation. We need to reach out and problem solve and work together and rebuild that trust and collaborate. And there are ways to do that through our state and our districts, and bring a mediator in before it escalates to something called a state complaint and the due process hearing, which is very much like a ticket you would receive when you break the law and go to court. It's a legal process. It doesn't leave a lot of good feelings. So I provided some links for you there. I'm going to encourage you to dive in if you're curious, or if you've been somehow involved or have heard of those before. But the most important thing for that slide is that you're aware of this piece. You're aware that there are further legal protections for families and things that can happen down the road, but you don't need to be the expert on those. That's there for your resource. We've given you lots of resources, either in the text, the article, or there's a couple on the slide. Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education is MARS. I've given you specific page numbers and ways to get right at parent definitions if you'd like to look more into the legal applications and requirements. But I've also provided a copy of the State of Michigan Procedural Safeguards Notice. The state and schools are required to notify of parents of their legal rights every year. So that's something for you to read and consider as an option also. We're going to take a turn here, and I want to make sure you've dug into the resources, the chapter, the article, and this lecture. And then we're going to take a look at a case study, and I'm going to walk you through that and scaffold that. So make sure you have a base knowledge, and then let's move on with a real example.